John had always enjoyed the thrill of delivering food late at night. The quiet, empty streets had a certain allure, and the tips were usually generous. On one particularly dark and stormy night, he received an order from an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation for being haunted, but John brushed off the rumors as mere urban legends. As he drove through the winding, rain-soaked roads, his GPS flickered and went out. Relying on memory and the occasional streetlight, John finally spotted the mansion. It was an imposing Gothic structure, its windows dark and unwelcoming. He parked his car and approached the massive front door, food bag in hand. John rang the bell, and after what seemed like an eternity, the door creaked open. An elderly woman with sunken eyes and a gaunt face stood before him. She smiled, revealing yellowed teeth, and invited him in to wait while she fetched the money. The interior was dimly lit and filled with antique furniture, giving it an eerie atmosphere. As John stood in the foyer, he heard faint whispers and the sound of footsteps above. Curiosity got the better of him, and he wandered deeper into the house. He reached a staircase and peered up, seeing nothing but darkness. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept past him, causing him to shiver. The whispers grew louder, and John swore he heard his name being called. He turned to leave, but the door had mysteriously shut. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. He fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. The only option was to find the old woman and get out of there. John ventured further into the mansion, the whispers now almost deafening. He opened a door to what appeared to be a study. The room was filled with books and old photographs. One photo caught his eye. It was of the elderly woman, but much younger, standing with a man and a child. The date on the photo was from the 1920s. A sudden noise made John spin around. The old woman stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with an unnatural glow. She told him that her family had lived in the mansion for generations and that they had never left. John tried to back away, but she advanced, her smile growing wider and more sinister. Desperate, John ran past her and up the staircase. The whispers followed him, now accompanied by laughter. He stumbled into a bedroom and slammed the door shut. The room was freezing, and he could see his breath. He turned around to find a mirror and gasped at his reflection. He looked decades older, his hair gray and his face wrinkled. The door burst open, and the old woman entered, flanked by the spectral forms of her family. They surrounded John, their eyes glowing with malevolence. The room began to spin, and John felt himself being pulled into darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. John awoke in his car, parked outside the mansion. The rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to rise. He looked at his hands. They were youthful again. He glanced at the mansion, which now appeared abandoned and in ruins. Confused and terrified, he drove away as fast as he could. Back at the delivery hub, John recounted his experience to his colleagues, but they all laughed it off as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that what he had experienced was real. A few days later, John did some research and discovered that the mansion had been abandoned for nearly a century after a tragic fire claimed the lives of its inhabitants. The elderly woman he had seen was the matriarch of the family, and she had been rumored to haunt the place ever since. John never took another late-night delivery order to that part of town again. The memory of that night haunted him, and he often woke up in a cold sweat, hearing whispers in the darkness. Despite his attempts to move on, John felt a lingering presence around him. He began seeing fleeting shadows and hearing faint voices no matter where he went. It was as if the spirits from the mansion had followed him. One night, as he was closing up his apartment, he caught a glimpse of the old woman in his bathroom mirror. She smiled, her eyes glowing with the same malevolence he had seen in the mansion. The whispers started again, louder this time, as the room grew cold. John realized too late that he had become part of the mansion's dark history, forever haunted by the spirits he had disturbed. Sara was a college student who worked part-time delivering food to make ends meet. It was a typical Friday night, and she had just received an order for a remote farmhouse on the edge of town. The address was unfamiliar, but the promise of a hefty tip convinced her to take the job. The drive was uneventful at first, but as she left the city behind, the roads became narrower and more isolated. Her GPS signal grew weak, and the directions became increasingly unreliable. After several wrong turns, she finally found the farmhouse, its dilapidated exterior barely visible under the dim moonlight. Sara parked her car and hesitated before approaching the house. The place looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds. She knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. A man in his 30s, disheveled and with hollow eyes, stood in the doorway. He apologized for the state of the house, explaining that he was renovating it. The man invited Sara inside to wait while he fetched his wallet. She stepped into the dimly lit hallway, feeling uneasy. The interior was in disarray, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. As she waited, she noticed a strange smell, a mix of mildew and something metallic. The man took longer than expected, and Sara's nerves began to fray. She called out, but there was no response. Determined to get her tip and leave, she ventured further into the house. The smell grew stronger, and she found herself in a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. On the kitchen table, she noticed several old newspapers with headlines about missing persons. Her heart raced as she realized the dates were recent. Panic set in, and she decided to leave immediately. As she turned to exit, she heard the floorboards creak behind her. Sara spun around to see the man standing in the doorway, holding a large knife. His eyes were wild, and he grinned maniacally. She bolted past him, but he grabbed her arm, pulling her back. She struggled and managed to break free, sprinting towards the front door. She flung the door open and ran to her car, the man close behind. She fumbled with her keys, hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. Just as she got in and started the engine, the man slammed into the side of the car, screaming incoherently. Sara sped away, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached a gas station several miles away. She called the police and reported the incident, but when they arrived at the farmhouse, it was empty. There were no signs of the man or any renovations. The police took Sara's statement, but found no evidence to support her story. They assured her they would keep an eye on the property, but suggested she might have been mistaken. Sara knew what she had seen, and the fear lingered. Determined to find answers, Sara did some digging on her own. She discovered that the farmhouse had a dark history. It had been the home of a reclusive man who was suspected of kidnapping several people over the years, but he had vanished without a trace. Sara couldn't shake the feeling that the man she encountered was somehow connected to the missing persons. She began to see his face in her nightmares, always with that same maniacal grin. The smell from the farmhouse haunted her senses, and she often woke up in a cold sweat. Months passed, and Sara tried to move on with her life. One night, she received another late-night delivery order to a remote location. Reluctantly, she accepted, hoping it would help her overcome her fear. The address led her to an old, run-down motel on the outskirts of town. As she approached the room number specified in the order, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. She knocked and called out, but there was no response. With her heart racing, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, and the familiar metallic smell hit her like a wave. Sara turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. The man from the farmhouse stood there, his eyes gleaming with madness. She screamed, but no one heard. The motel had been abandoned for years, and she realized too late that she had been lured into a trap. The man grinned, raising the knife, and the darkness closed in around her. Mark was a seasoned delivery driver, accustomed to the strange and unusual requests that came with the job. However, nothing could have prepared him for the eerie delivery that awaited him one cold winter night. He received an order for a house on the outskirts of the city, a place he had never been before. The address led him to a secluded neighborhood with large Victorian-style houses. As he approached the destination, he noticed that the house was completely dark. The only light came from a flickering street lamp nearby, casting ominous shadows on the snow-covered ground. Mark parked his car and walked up the creaky steps to the front door. He rang the bell, and after a moment, the door opened slightly. A young woman with a pale, ghostly appearance peeked out and asked him to come inside. She explained that her mother was upstairs and would be down shortly to pay for the food. Reluctantly, Mark stepped inside, immediately feeling a chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The house was eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy. He waited in the foyer, glancing around at the antique furniture and dusty portraits on the walls. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of the mother. Mark called out, but the only response was an unsettling silence. Growing uneasy, he decided to find the woman and leave as quickly as possible. He ventured deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking under his weight. As he climbed the stairs, he heard faint whispers and the distant sound of sobbing. He followed the noise to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and he pushed it open, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. The sobbing grew louder, but he couldn't see anyone. Mark turned on his phone's flashlight and scanned the room. The light fell on a figure huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth. It was the young woman, her face buried in her hands. He approached her cautiously, asking if she was okay. The woman looked up, her eyes filled with terror. She whispered that her mother was coming and that he needed to leave before it was too late. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Mark turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her eyes cold and lifeless. She glided towards him, her feet not touching the ground. Panic set in, and he backed away, but the door slammed shut behind him. The woman raised her hand, and Mark felt an invisible force constricting his chest. He struggled to breathe, dropping to his knees. The young woman screamed, begging her mother to stop, but the old woman was relentless. Just as Mark's vision began to blur, the force suddenly released him. He gasped for air and looked up to see the young woman standing between him and the old woman, her face determined. She told Mark to run, and he didn't hesitate. Mark stumbled down the stairs, the whispers and sobbing following him. He reached the front door and flung it open, racing to his car. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the old woman standing on the porch, her eyes boring into him. He didn't stop until he reached a well-lit gas station, where he called the police. They arrived quickly but found no evidence of anyone living in the house. The place had been abandoned for years, and the locals claimed it was haunted by the spirits of a mother and daughter who had died tragically. Despite the police's assurances that it was just a ghost story, Mark couldn't shake the experience. He began having nightmares, waking up to the sound of whispers and feeling the chill of the house. He even saw the old woman in his dreams, her lifeless eyes watching him. Months later, Mark received another late-night delivery order to a remote address. As he approached the location, a sense of dread washed over him. The house looked eerily similar to the haunted one. When he arrived, the door opened, and the young woman stood there, her eyes pleading. Mark realized too late that he had been drawn back into their ghostly grip, and the cycle of terror would continue.